Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Mark trudged along the slick sidewalks of a small college town in Texas, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking through his jacket, but he hardly noticed. His mind was consumed with the reality of his life bills he couldn't pay, dreams that felt so far out of reach, and the constant weight of knowing that he was letting his family down. His mother's illness, the debts, his sister's tuition, everything was piling up. He needed a way out, but he didn't know how to find it. He sighed deeply, pulling his collar up against the chill. Then, his phone buzzed. A new message, a name he didn't recognize. Eleanor Brooks. Mark frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen. Who was Eleanor Brooks? He opened the message. When he arrived at the upscale restaurant, the contrast between the warmth inside and the cold outside was jarring. He shook off the rain and stepped inside, looking around nervously. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air, but he could hardly focus on anything but the tightness in his chest. He walked up to the counter, looking for a familiar face, and there, sitting at a corner table, was Eleanor Brooks. She was stunning, tall, poised, her silver hair styled elegantly, her eyes sharp and calculating as she glanced at him. She had the air of someone who was used to being in control. Mark, on the other hand, felt completely out of place. He stood there for a moment, unsure if he should approach or turn and walk away. But then she waved him over. Eleanor's gaze softened just slightly as she added, "I'm not asking for a love story, Mark. I'm asking for a partnership. I believe this can be mutually beneficial." Mark took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "I'll do it." And just like that, his life was about to change forever. Mark's heart was still racing as he left the bistro. He had barely processed Eleanor's offer before he found himself agreeing to something he never thought he would, marrying a stranger for a business deal. The rain was still falling hard as he walked down the street, the cold biting through his jacket. His thoughts raced in a blur. What did I just agree to, he wondered. It felt surreal, like he was watching someone else make the decision. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, staring at the screen. There were messages from his mother, from his sister, all reminding him of his responsibilities, of the weight he carried. But now, there was a way out. A lifeline, however strange it may seem. He arrived home later that evening to the quiet emptiness of his apartment. It was a small, cramped place, barely enough room for him, let alone the baggage he carried. The flickering light from a nearby street lamp cast shadows across the room, and Mark's reflection in the window reminded him of how much he had changed, how far he had fallen. He sank into the worn-out couch and rubbed his face. He knew he couldn't back out now. He had given his word. The next morning, Mark woke up to an unfamiliar feeling. There was a strange clarity in his mind, the realization that his life was about to change drastically. He had always dreamed of a better life, but this was something else. He had barely enough time to get ready for his meeting with Eleanor when his phone buzzed again. Mark ran his fingers through his hair. This was happening. There was no turning back now. The next day, Mark found himself in a sleek, modern office building, the kind he had only seen on TV. The lobby was pristine, the floors shining under the bright fluorescent lights. Eleanor was waiting for him in a private conference room, her expression as calm and collected as ever. She gestured for him to sit. Mark nodded, still feeling like a fish out of water. Eleanor handed him a thick folder, full of papers, contracts, terms, everything he needed to sign. The paperwork was all straightforward, filled with legal jargon he barely understood. But one thing was clear: signing this would mean he would no longer be in debt. His family's bills, his mother's medical expenses, all of it would be taken care of. Eleanor watched him silently as he flipped through the papers. When he reached the last page, she met his gaze, her expression unreadable. He stared at the page before him. His signature was the last thing standing between him and everything he had dreamed of. But it was also the last thing standing between him and a life he never imagined. He reached for the pen, his hand trembling slightly. Just before he signed, Eleanor spoke again, her tone softer this time. Mark hesitated for a moment longer, then finally signed the contract. The decision had been made. As soon as the pen left the paper, Eleanor stood up and extended her hand. "Congratulations," she said, her tone as cool and businesslike as ever. "You're officially my husband now." Mark stood up, his head spinning. He had made the choice, but part of him still wasn't sure if it was the right one. He glanced at the contract once more, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Eleanor, sensing his unease, gave him a reassuring smile. Mark nodded slowly, still unsure of what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was certain: his life was no longer the same. He had agreed to marry Eleanor, but in his heart, he couldn't help but wonder what this partnership would truly mean. The weight of his decision was heavy, but there was no turning back now. Mark sat in the back of the sleek, black car as it glided through the busy streets of the city. His thoughts were a tangled mess. The moment he signed the contract, his life had been set on a path he never expected. He kept replaying the conversation with Eleanor in his mind. "This is just the beginning," she had said, but Mark wasn't so sure. What had he gotten himself into? The wealth, the promises, the sudden shift in his life, it was all too overwhelming. He had agreed to marry a stranger, a woman he barely knew, and now he was about to enter a world he had only seen from the outside. He tried to push away the doubt, but it lingered, heavy in his chest. As the car pulled up to the grand mansion, Mark felt the familiar weight of uncertainty press on him once again. Eleanor's estate was massive, more than he had ever imagined. The sprawling estate stood behind a high iron gate, its marble facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. The driver opened the door for him, and Mark stepped out, his shoes clicking against the perfectly manicured stone pathway. The whole place looked like something out of a dream, elegant, imposing, and completely foreign to him. Eleanor was already waiting for him at the entrance, standing tall and composed as always. She greeted him with a polite nod, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Welcome," she said, her voice smooth. "I'm sure you'll find everything to your liking. This will be your home for the foreseeable future." Mark followed her inside, his eyes taking in the lavish decor, the expensive furnishings. It was a stark contrast to the small apartment he had just left behind. This was a world of wealth and privilege, one that he now belonged to, at least on paper. As they walked through the grand hallway, Eleanor pointed out the various rooms, offering him a tour of the estate. The place was filled with ornate paintings, golden chandeliers, and marble floors that gleamed beneath their feet. Mark felt small, out of place. He was just a law student from a struggling family, and yet here he was, about to be married to the woman who owned all of this. The following days were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and events he had never imagined he would attend. Eleanor kept him busy, introducing him to people from her world: high-powered executives, investors, and philanthropists. They all treated him with politeness, but Mark could tell they were sizing him up, questioning why Eleanor had chosen him. Every time he walked into a room, he felt the weight of their gazes, wondering what he was doing there, what he had to offer. But Eleanor never seemed to care. She was always calm, always in control, and always focused on the bigger picture. One night, after an especially long day, Eleanor invited Mark to dinner. The setting was intimate, with soft candlelight casting a warm glow on the elegant table set for two. Eleanor looked beautiful, as always, in a dark blue dress that accentuated her graceful figure. Mark felt out of his depth, but he took a seat across from her, trying to mask his discomfort. Mark nodded slowly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he understood. His thoughts were clouded, and for the first time since signing the contract, he began to wonder if he was in over his head. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to their shared goals. Eleanor spoke about her business ventures, her philanthropic work, and the legacy she hoped to build. She spoke with such conviction, such certainty. Mark listened, captivated by her drive, but still unsure of where he fit into her grand plans. He had never imagined himself as part of someone's empire, let alone someone like Eleanor's. Yet, here he was, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was meant for more than just playing the part of her husband. By the time dinner ended, Mark was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He had signed the contract, he had entered this world, but he wasn't sure he belonged. And as Eleanor bid him good night, her smile cool and controlled, Mark couldn't shake the thought that there was much more at play here, something he hadn't yet figured out. He knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like a blur to Mark. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of the soft hum of the mansion's grandeur. The staff moved quietly through the halls, the polished floors reflecting their every step, while Mark, now a part of this world, felt like an outsider still trying to find his place. He had signed the contract, agreed to the arrangement, but there were moments when he couldn't help but feel that it was all a bit too much. The fine meals, the lavish surroundings, the endless events, it was all so foreign. Eleanor remained as composed as ever, her life flowing effortlessly, while Mark was left trying to figure out where he fit into her world. One evening, Eleanor invited Mark to an exclusive gala she was hosting. It was a grand affair, held at one of the most prestigious venues in the city. Mark had never attended such an event in his life. The moment they arrived, Mark felt like he had stepped into a different world entirely. Elegant women in glittering gowns, men in sharp tuxedos, and the buzz of high society filled the air. It was a world of power, influence, and wealth, and here he was, standing beside Eleanor, a man who had come from nothing, pretending to be part of it all. Eleanor looked every bit the part of the elegant, powerful woman she was. She was the picture of confidence, her poise impeccable as she moved through the crowd with ease. Mark, on the other hand, felt like a fish out of water. He adjusted his suit nervously, his eyes darting between the guests as they exchanged pleasantries. Every time he tried to strike up a conversation, it felt awkward, forced. He was used to casual, small-town life, not this world of polished smiles and hidden agendas. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself standing off to the side, watching Eleanor work the room. She was in her element, charming the most influential people with her grace and intelligence. Mark admired her, but there was a part of him that felt distant from her. Yes, they had signed an agreement, but it wasn't just business anymore. As he watched her from across the room, he realized that something was shifting inside him. This wasn't just a partnership, it was beginning to feel like something more. Later in the evening, Eleanor excused herself from a conversation and walked over to Mark. She smiled at him, her expression warm yet controlled. Mark gave her a tight smile, nodding in response. "Yeah, just a little out of my element," he admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. As the night went on, Mark couldn't help but notice how Eleanor moved through the crowd with such ease, making those connections effortlessly. She had a way about her, a presence that commanded attention, and Mark began to wonder just how much of herself she had sacrificed to get to where she was. It was clear she wasn't just playing a role, this was who she was. A woman of power, with a purpose, and a vision that seemed so far removed from everything Mark had known. After the gala, as they walked back to the mansion, the car ride was silent at first. Mark sat next to Eleanor, his mind swirling with thoughts of the evening. He had felt out of place, but he had also felt something else. A growing sense of admiration for her. Eleanor had worked so hard to build this empire, to create this life of luxury and control. She had the world at her feet, and he was still trying to catch up. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice soft in the quiet of the car. Mark nodded, but deep down, he felt the weight of it all. He had signed up for this, yes. He had agreed to this life, this arrangement. But something inside him was beginning to shift. As much as he tried to tell himself this was just business, the growing connection he felt toward Eleanor was undeniable. And as they pulled up to the mansion, Mark knew that whatever was happening between them, it was no longer just a contract, it was becoming something far more complex. The days following the gala felt like they stretched into an endless cycle for Mark. Each morning, he woke up in the lavish guest room of Eleanor's mansion, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of the estate's sprawling gardens seemed so far removed from the cramped, modest apartment he used to call home. Despite the luxury around him, Mark still couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong in this world. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, "We're a team." But the more he saw of her life, the more he wondered what that really meant for him. It wasn't just about the business deal anymore. There was something else, a growing sense of something deeper between them that Mark wasn't ready to confront. One afternoon, Mark was sitting in the study, trying to catch up on the reading he had missed during the past few days of adjusting to his new life. He had always been determined to succeed, even when the odds were against him, but now, with Eleanor's wealth and influence surrounding him, it felt like he was a fish out of water. As he flipped through the pages of the legal documents and contracts Eleanor had asked him to review, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor walked closer, her heels clicking softly on the floor. She stopped beside him, glancing down at the papers scattered across the desk. "I understand," she said gently, her tone softening. "This life, this world, it's not easy to get used to. But remember, we're in this together. I won't ask you to do anything you're uncomfortable with." Her words were reassuring, but something in Mark's gut told him that there was more at play here. He had agreed to the marriage, but the longer he spent in Eleanor's world, the more he realized how little he knew about her. She was a woman of mystery, her motives always veiled behind a perfect smile and cool composure. Eleanor's smile never wavered, but there was something different in the way she looked at him now. It was as if she was seeing him for the first time, truly seeing him beyond the contract they had signed. For a moment, the cold, businesslike veneer she always wore seemed to crack. Mark's heart raced at her words. He hadn't realized it before, but in that moment, he saw a glimpse of the woman beneath the polished exterior. She wasn't just a businesswoman or a billionaire, she was someone with hopes, dreams, and vulnerabilities, just like him. Eleanor gave him a knowing smile and placed a hand on his shoulder. "One step at a time," she replied. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take it day by day, and we'll figure it out together." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He had always been a man of action, of moving forward, but this was different. This wasn't just about his future. This was about their future together. And as Eleanor turned to leave the room, her eyes lingering on him for just a moment longer, Mark knew that whatever this partnership was becoming, it was something neither of them could have predicted. The door clicked softly behind her, and Mark was left alone with his thoughts. As he stared at the papers on his desk, a strange feeling washed over him, one he couldn't quite place. But deep down, he knew that his life was changing in ways he couldn't control, and for better or worse, there was no going back. Days passed, and Mark continued to settle into his new life, though the sense of discomfort he felt never fully disappeared. Eleanor's mansion had become both a sanctuary and a cage, luxurious and cold in its perfection. He spent his days attending meetings, reviewing documents, and attending high-profile events, but it all felt like he was playing a role he hadn't fully prepared for. Eleanor was always there, guiding him, ensuring he kept up appearances. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized just how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a powerful businesswoman, she was someone who had built an empire with her own hands, and the weight of that responsibility seemed to hang over her every move. One evening, after a particularly long day of events, Mark sat alone in the study, reviewing some papers Eleanor had left for him. His mind wandered as he skimmed through the documents, but he couldn't focus. The tension between them had been building for days, something unspoken, but always present. He had been careful not to let his feelings show, but there were moments when he caught himself thinking about Eleanor in ways that went beyond their agreement. It was a dangerous thought, one that didn't belong in a contract, but it was there, lingering. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door, and Eleanor stepped inside. She looked as composed as always, but there was something different about her tonight. Her eyes were softer, her movements slower. For the first time, Mark saw her not as the powerful businesswoman, but as a woman who carried a heavy burden, someone who had fought to get where she was and wasn't about to let anyone see her weakness. Mark looked up at her, a little surprised. He had grown used to their professional interactions, but there was an air of something more personal tonight. He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Eleanor sat across from him, her posture still perfect, but there was a vulnerability in the way she held herself that he hadn't noticed before. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to acknowledge it like this. He had always seen their marriage as a business contract, a way for both of them to get what they needed. But the way she was speaking now softly, honestly, it made him wonder if she was starting to see him as more than just a partner in this arrangement. Mark swallowed, unsure of how to respond. This was territory he wasn't sure he was ready for. He had never expected to develop real feelings for Eleanor, not in this setting, not with everything so transactional. But her words, her honesty, made him feel like he was seeing a side of her he had never imagined. Eleanor smiled softly, a hint of relief in her expression. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table between them. Mark could feel his heart racing. This wasn't what he had expected. He had expected the usual business talk, the usual cool, detached Eleanor. But tonight, she had opened up to him in a way that felt real, vulnerable, human. Eleanor's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing her hand on his for the first time. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. Mark could feel the connection between them deepening, the lines between business and something more starting to blur. For the first time, Mark realized that the life he had stepped into was not just about the wealth and status it provided. It was about something much more profound. Something that, despite his reservations, he was beginning to want as much as Eleanor did. As they sat in silence, the weight of their unspoken understanding hung in the air between them. Mark wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: this partnership, this contract, was no longer just a business deal. It was something more. The days after their conversation were different for Mark. Something had shifted between him and Eleanor. They were still bound by their agreement, still walking a fine line between business and something more, but there was a growing understanding between them that couldn't be ignored. They spent more time together, whether it was attending events, reviewing business matters, or simply talking in the quiet of the evenings. And every time Mark looked at Eleanor, he found himself seeing her in a new light, as if the walls she had so carefully built around herself were slowly starting to crumble. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, something unexpected happened. Mark received a call one afternoon from his mother. The news was urgent: her health had taken a turn for the worse, and the doctors were no longer hopeful. Mark's heart sank as he listened to the words. He had always been the one to take care of his family, to shoulder the responsibility. Now, he felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. Without thinking, Mark packed his bags and left the mansion, heading straight for the hospital. The drive felt long and empty, his mind racing with thoughts of what he might face when he arrived. As he entered his mother's room, he found her lying in bed, pale and weak, but still holding on. His sister was by her side, tears in her eyes. The moment he stepped into the room, his sister gave him a look of relief. Mark had always been the rock of their family, the one they could count on. "I don't know what to do, Mark," his sister said softly. "She's getting worse every day." Mark took a seat next to his mother, his hand brushing against hers. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He had always promised his mother that he would be there for her, but now, he wasn't so sure how much longer he could hold on. That night, as he sat by his mother's side, the weight of his new life began to feel heavier than ever. He had made the choice to sign that contract with Eleanor, to step into her world, but now he wondered if he had made the right decision. Was it worth it? Was this the life he wanted? The life of luxury, the life of power, the life of someone who had everything but was always just a little too distant to feel real? The next morning, Mark returned to the mansion. He hadn't slept much, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. As soon as he walked through the door, Eleanor was waiting for him. She could see the strain in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Eleanor's face softened as she took a step toward him. "I'm so sorry, Mark," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "I know this must be so difficult for you." Mark nodded, his emotions barely contained. "I don't know what to do. I'm trying to be there for her, but everything is moving so fast." Eleanor looked at him with a mix of sympathy and understanding. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said quietly. "I'm here for you, Mark. Whatever you need, I'll help." The sincerity in her voice caught Mark off guard. For the first time since signing their contract, he felt like Eleanor wasn't just a business partner, but someone who truly cared about him. Maybe he had been wrong about her. Maybe this wasn't just a deal anymore. As Mark sat down in the sitting room, his mind was still clouded by everything that had happened. Eleanor sat across from him, her eyes watching him closely, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything more. He needed time to process everything, to figure out what he was truly feeling. But just then, Eleanor spoke again, her voice steady and reassuring. Her words echoed in Mark's mind, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe them. Eleanor had been right, this wasn't just about the contract anymore. Something deeper had begun to form between them, and though he was uncertain of what the future held, for the first time, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. The following days felt like a blur to Mark. His mother's condition remained critical, and the weight of his family's crisis loomed over him. He spent his time between the hospital and the mansion, torn between his old life and the new one he was building with Eleanor. The more time he spent in both worlds, the more the lines blurred. Eleanor had been supportive, understanding, and always there when he needed her, but there was still a part of him that felt conflicted. He had signed up for a contract, a business arrangement, but it was starting to feel like something more. Something he wasn't prepared for. One afternoon, as he sat in the quiet of the mansion's garden, staring out at the manicured grounds, Eleanor approached him. She had a gentle presence, her usual calm demeanor softened by the concern she had shown him over the past few days. She sat down beside him, the weight of her gaze asking the questions neither of them had spoken aloud. He sighed deeply, running his fingers through his hair. "It's just a lot, Eleanor. My family, this life, everything. It's all so overwhelming." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words. She reached out and placed a hand on his, a simple gesture, but one that seemed to carry more meaning than anything they had discussed before. Her words were comforting, but Mark couldn't shake the sense of uncertainty that had settled in his chest. He had promised to be there for Eleanor, to honor their agreement. But as they sat together, he realized that the line between obligation and something deeper was becoming harder to define. Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of understanding and something else, something more personal. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimpse of the woman beneath the carefully constructed exterior. Mark looked at her, the sincerity in her words breaking through his defenses. For so long, he had been driven by the need to prove himself, to make a name for himself, to escape the burdens of his past. But in that moment, he realized that it wasn't just about success or wealth, it was about connection. It was about trust. And he was starting to trust her. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor spent more time together, their conversations becoming less about the contract and more about their lives, their pasts, and their hopes for the future. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. Eleanor opened up about her childhood, the sacrifices she had made to build her empire, and the loneliness she sometimes felt at the top. Mark, in turn, shared his own struggles, the pressure of his family's expectations, the fear of failure, and the uncertainty of his future. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Eleanor stood up from the table, her eyes meeting Mark's with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. Mark's pulse quickened as he met her gaze. He had been avoiding this conversation, avoiding the truth he had been afraid to face. But now, in the quiet of the room, with nothing but the sound of their breathing between them, he realized that she was right. Eleanor smiled, her expression softening. "I'm glad you see it too," she said quietly, stepping closer to him. "Because I've been feeling the same way." In that moment, Mark understood. He had entered this arrangement with one idea in mind, but somewhere along the way, it had turned into something entirely different. Something real. And despite all the uncertainty, all the fear of the unknown, he found himself wanting to explore it further. As they stood there, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing on the edge of something neither of them had expected, but both of them were ready to embrace. Mark reached out and took her hand, and for the first time since he had signed that contract, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days after their quiet conversation felt like a turning point for Mark. He had never expected to feel so deeply connected to Eleanor, not when everything between them had started as a business arrangement, a way out of his debts. But now, things were different. The walls they had both carefully built around their lives were starting to come down, and in their place, something real was growing. Mark found himself thinking about her more and more, not just as a business partner, but as someone he truly cared about. The once cold and calculated nature of their arrangement had shifted into something deeper, more meaningful. As the weeks passed, Mark's life slowly began to settle into this new rhythm. Eleanor remained by his side, offering support not only in the boardroom but also in ways that mattered more deeply through the quiet moments, the conversations they shared, and the way she always seemed to understand him even when he couldn't put his own feelings into words. She was no longer just the powerful woman who had rescued him from financial ruin. She had become his confidant, his partner, in every sense of the word. One evening, as they sat in the garden of the mansion, the soft glow of the sunset casting a warm light across the manicured lawn, Eleanor turned to Mark with a serious expression. There was a calmness in her gaze, but also an undeniable sense of resolve. Mark's heart raced at her words. It wasn't just the shock of hearing them, it was the realization that he had been feeling the same way. He had spent so much time convincing himself that this was just a business deal, that he couldn't afford to think beyond the surface. But now, standing there in the fading light, he knew that everything had changed. Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening. She took a step closer to him, her hand gently resting on his. Mark's breath caught in his chest. For the first time, he realized that what they had wasn't a contract Anna-Marie, it was a relationship, one built on trust, understanding, and something deeper that neither of them had expected. Their hands met, their fingers intertwining as they stood together, the weight of their decision settling over them both. They had started this journey as strangers, bound by a contract. But now, they were standing at the edge of something real, something they had both been afraid to admit they wanted. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in golden light, they both knew that this was only the beginning. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, they were no longer walking it alone.